My name is Sibusiso Biyela. I am a science communicator based in South Africa. And basically, what I do here is work with researchers from institutions, from universities, and such. And I work with them to produce certain types of science communication content. It could be policy briefs, videos, websites, magazines, all sorts of um, creations and tools like that. And recently, or for a while now, we've been doing science communication beyond English, and we sort of call this decolonizing science communication because we're doing it for African languages and trying to get more an audience that includes more non-science people, such as everyone else that we would be communicating with as per usual, but now making the content more suited for anyone else who doesn't either speak English or is more comfortable learning about science in another language. What inspired me is growing up in South Africa and having to learn science at the same time that I'm learning English. And that can be quite difficult learning this incredible new concept and having to learn a new language at the same time. You start to associate it with a lot of difficulty, and you start to associate it with English itself. So it becomes this colonial concept that doesn't belong to you as an African. It creates that feeling. And it's not for a lack of trying. Throughout history, that a lot of science has been seen by indigenous people all over the world as a very bad thing because of the effect it's had on them and how it's been done on them unethically. And it creates this notion, especially in South Africa, that science is not for you as an African. And although we've reached the new dispensation since 1994 in South Africa when we've had democracy, there's still that idea that because we can only do science in English, it's not really for us as African people. So clearly that's not true, but it's difficult to argue otherwise if you can't do science or talk about science in your own language, that it can only be done in English and Afrikaans. So I feel that we have to decolonize science communication or science in general so that there's a cultural ownership of science and its concepts for African people. And I think the greatest way that we can do that is by communicating science in one's own language. isiZulu is my home language, or Zulu for short. So Zulu is the most popular language in South Africa by it's the most popular by just the sheer numbers. It's spoken by around 10 to 12 million people in the country. It is one of 11 official languages in South Africa. That makes it one of the 9 indigenous languages in South Africa, not counting English and Afrikaans in the country. So it's the most popular language in the country, but a lot of science and technology isn't done in the language at all. And it's very difficult to talk about science or communicate science in isiZulu and other African languages in the country because there aren't many words in terms of vocabulary that you can employ as a science communicator or as a journalist if you wanted to talk about science. So that's the that's basically like the long and short of it when it comes to isiZulu in the country and any science communication that's done using the language. I can start with something simple when it comes to simple scientific terms that are not available in isiZulu. Um, there's a lot of talk these days with a lot of media that's talking about dinosaurs. I would call it like a media resurgence in a way. The dinosaurs are becoming quite popular again, and they're one of my favorite things to talk about dinosaurs. Um, but there is no word for dinosaur in isiZulu, which presents a problem when, for example, I want to write an article, as I've done before, about a new scientific discovery, a new fossil discovery or description in the country. And I'm trying to talk about the discovery of the fossil itself, but I can't talk about the word dinosaur or dinosaurs in general because there is no word for dinosaur in isiZulu. So that's the first hurdle. And then you have to think about a word for the word fossil, or even millions of years, or even that whole concept of fossilization and all those things. So, what ends up happening is that you have to start explaining all these terms before you can start telling the story, before you can start communicating the science. You have the problem of having to explain a lot more than you would if you were doing it in English, which is problematic. Yes, it does present an opportunity for me to talk about. The concept of dinosaurs much more than I would if I was doing it in English, but still, it takes a lot of time and effort from the science communication that's supposed to happen. Something else that might want to talk about is maybe even the idea of my other favorite thing in science, which is astronomy. How do you talk about space? How do you talk about the stars? How do you talk about all sorts of things surrounding astronomy and astrophysics in general, when the Zulu word for space is very much related to or is a translation for the word the spirit dimension, right? So you have a problem when you're trying to talk about something new that's happening in space science or in astronomy. And now you have to explain that what you're talking about is not a spiritual realm. You're talking about outer space, other planets, and those things. So it's those just space itself and dinosaurs, things that you don't even think about, things that we take for granted when you talk about them in English, become problematic when you try to talk about them in isiZulu and other African languages. So that's you can imagine that's where the hurdle begins before you even get into the nitty gritty of the exciting science news that you'd like to talk about with your audience. We ran into a few hurdles like everyone else around the world, but we had our own here as well when it comes to communicating the science of vaccines, the virus itself, and how it works, and things that people should take precaution about. Of course, there's always the issue of trust when it comes to science. And a lot of people distrust science itself and distrust the government when the thing that's being explained to them isn't explained well. And I've seen that when it comes to communicating science in an African language, it's a matter of instilling trust in whatever institution is communicating that science, because you're trying to allow the audience you're speaking to be able to engage with you. They might not understand 100% completely the first time you talk about something, but you should give them something just enough for them to be able to grab onto and be able to ask questions and things like that. So one of the issues that we came across when it comes to communicating about the coronavirus was, in isiZulu, there's no distinction between a virus and a bacteria, right? And that can be problematic when people want to take certain drugs, such as antibiotics for a virus, right? So you can imagine that it's difficult when you say the word for virus and bacteria is the same, much like the English term germ, right? So if you tell someone that there's a germ going around hurting people and they have to take certain precautions to protect themselves, and then they say, but I have antibiotics, I can protect myself or something like that, and then you tell them that antibiotics actually work on bacteria, not viruses. I have to explain the difference between those two things. And by the time you are explaining those things, there are alternative narratives that seek to simplify or have much simpler explanations for the virus, and those narratives then provide their own quote unquote traditional medicine. There was a story that came out in Madagascar about this miracle cure. Which came from a plant that's also available in South Africa as well. So people were trying to use that plant to beat the coronavirus instead of using um, other proven medical procedures. So there's that issue that you have a hard time even explaining simple things as the difference between a virus and a bacteria. What hope do you have to dispel people's doubts that you are not lying to them, even though the thing that you're trying to explain to them is very difficult to explain? So that's the issue that we ran into, that we found ourselves in. So a lot of indigenous people or Africans who speak indigenous languages are susceptible to these conspiracy theories and misinformation for the very reason that they are unable to trust the institutions that are trying to explain to them these scientific terms. And it all comes down to the institutions themselves not understanding their audience, which is the very first thing you learn when it comes to science communication, is to try to understand your audience as much as you can. So, like the default from the government and other institutions of trust is that you just give people information that's factual and people can decide for themselves. But that doesn't always work. If you don't if you don't think so much about the audience that you're communicating with. And one of the things that you have to understand about the audience that speaks a certain language, even though they do understand English, is that you can speak to them about anything else in their home language, in their mother tongue. But the fact that you have to switch to English to explain to them how the virus works or how any other scientific concept works, that trust shifts away from you because you're unable to speak to them with respect. You can't be on the same level as them. It's not that they can't understand English, they can, but the fact that you've switched to English, it's you're taking them back to school. It's a language that they use only at school. It's a language that you use at work, right? It's not something that's done in the home usually, even though they do understand English, right? And they associate science with something that's difficult, not for them, with a lot of bad history as well. And so it's that lack of trust that comes from being unable to communicate in someone's language that produces a lack of trust, which makes them susceptible to conspiracy theories. Because I will try to explain to someone in English something that's factual, right? But it doesn't make them receptive. It would make them receptive to someone else who's able to bring about misinformation um, in a much better package, which is their own language, and telling them that some miracle cure, some traditional medicine is actually going to work for them because that Western medicine doesn't work. And there's jokes that go around, sort of a meme that says, "Why would you want to put something in your body, something that you can't even pronounce, right? Why do you want to put these chemicals in your body?" So um, it's difficult then to explain to people that these chemicals that can't be pronounced are actually safe, when someone comes with a better story in their own language and says, I have something that you know of. You know that tree over there? I can take it and I can turn it into a cure. but these people are talking about certain things that you can't even see, and they're telling you that it's going to be it's going to cure you or it's going to help you. Why? How can you trust those people? So yes, they're susceptible to conspiracy theories, but it's for good reasons, because someone else is doing a better job at communicating with them than we are. And the first problem is the language. The South African government has had a lot of bodies and initiatives that are trying to promote local languages through science and technology. Some of those include having young science journalists being stationed at local newspapers and local radio stations where they talk about certain scientific news in local languages. That's been going on for a while. And then there's non-government efforts, such as the one that I'm involved in. We've just started a project in the last year or so, where we've been trying to create an artificial intelligence tool that no a translation tool that uses machine learning to be able to translate scientific texts into 6 African languages, because the issue that we have is a problem of standardization. If I myself, as a science communicator in South Africa, is trying to communicate a certain scientific concept into isiZulu, I have to come up with my own way of translating it, my own way, my own words for dinosaur, my own words for space, but I can't be sure if that's the term that a scientist would use, or if another science communicator or a science journalist would be using. So it might end up being that all 3 of us might try to communicate with the same community, but because we came up with different words and different interpretations of the same scientific concept, it might end up being confusing. So we're hoping that this tool is a collaborative way of getting a lot of people to be able to have a reference, sort of like a Zulu English dictionary, have a reference that you can know that if you're creating a certain piece of content, you'll know that someone else will be using that same term, that same word, so that science is done or communicated well. So that's the idea behind the project. So we're hoping with those initiatives that I've mentioned that science communication in local languages will become more fashionable. So yes, there are a few scientists who've been quite active in wanting to be part of the project, and these are researchers from linguists themselves who want to be part of the project to see how it gets done. Some of them are natural scientists who've had their own ideas about how to translate their own work. So there's been a lot of interest from scientists as well. A lot of other researchers who have been trying to do this work themselves, and now realizing that, like, they sort of try to do it in their own work when they are talking to their local communities, or even with their lectures when they're lecturing in class. So yeah, there's been a lot of that excitement, and it's part of the reason that I'm encouraged to continue with the work. At first, it was just a very small thing that I was doing, but the excitement that I've received from scientists in terms of encouragement and them wanting to take part in the projects that I'm working on has been quite encouraging. So there's a lot of scientists in the field, and scientists who are science communicators themselves, who are excited to keep this sort of project of decolonizing science going. My advice for them is, and it's the simplest advice, which is to talk to local communities. Ask them all sorts of questions. because you never want to impose anything on them. Like, you might achieve the goal of being able to communicate with them in their language, but you don't want to be still imposing on them, telling them what their problem is, or anything like that. There's different reasons you might want to communicate with them. You might want to get from them certain local knowledge to be part of your project. You might want to give them information that might be important to them based on the research that you've done, even though you haven't involved them from the beginning of the project. But that will, knowing what you're trying to do for them or with them, will inform how you approach the research or how you approach the communication with them. Yeah, that's the advice that I would give, which is to just talk to those local communities. It helps if you know the language. It helps if you know the culture. Um, but it's important to be careful never to impose or to give the impression of imposing any knowledge upon them or any scientific findings to them, because you have to understand that they have their own local knowledge. It might be that they are not as receptive to the information that you're giving them or the questions that you're asking. So it's important to understand what they know, understand your audience by just speaking to them, so that you understand that you're on the same level as them in terms of respect and tradition and ritual.